February 14th, 1945. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Apartment on Melwood Avenue, 4:23 a.m. Lorraine Hadley woke not from noise but from silence. That particular dense silence that settles when someone leaves a home forever. She lay in the darkness listening to her own breathing and knew, even before opening her eyes, that Warren would never return. Not today, not tomorrow. Never. She reached her hand across to his side of the bed. The sheet was cold. He'd left hours ago, 3, maybe 4. While she'd slept the heavy sleep of an exhausted woman who'd spent her day working an 8-hour shift at the munitions plant, standing 2 hours in ration lines for butter and meat, cooking dinner, washing the boys' shirts, and darning yet another hole in the youngest one's winter coat. Lorraine was 35 years old. But on the morning of February 14th, she felt ancient. The apartment was freezing. The radiator hissed and clanked but gave off barely any heat. The building superintendent, old Mr. Novak, was stingy with the coal, said it was wartime conservation, but everyone knew he was just cheap. Lorraine pulled Warren's old cardigan around her shoulders, the one with the moth holes in the elbows that she'd meant to darn but never found time for. It still smelled like him. Tobacco from his Lucky Strikes, the bitter tang of the machine oil from the plant, and underneath it all, something distinctly Warren, the scent she'd known for 12 years of marriage. She rose. Her bare feet touched the cold linoleum. In the hallway, the lamp burned under an old fringe shade she'd sewn herself 10 years ago when they'd first moved into this apartment. Warren always forgot to turn it off. No, she thought, correcting herself. Used to forget. Now it didn't matter. His overcoat was gone from the rack. Gone was his fedora with the torn brim that he'd worn for 5 years, the one he'd bought at Kaufman's department store when they still had money to spend on such things. Gone were his work boots from beside the mirror, the ones with the cracked leather she'd asked him to take to the cobbler 3 times, the ones he kept saying he'd get around to fixing next week, next month, someday. Lorraine walked slowly down the narrow hallway, her hand trailing along the wallpaper with its faded rose pattern. She remembered the day they'd hung that paper together, back in 1936, when Marshall was just a baby and the world still made sense. Warren had been whistling while he worked, making jokes about the crooked seams, kissing flour paste off her nose. They'd been happy then. Or she'd thought they were. Maybe happiness was always just a performance, a shared delusion that could be packed up and carried away in the middle of the night. She went to the kitchen. The table was empty. No note. No explanation. Just emptiness that screamed louder than any words. The tin clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking time that would never stop, that would carry her forward whether she wanted to move or not. On the counter sat the pot roast from last night's dinner, covered with a dish towel. Warren hadn't even finished his portion. Had pushed it around his plate while reading the Pittsburgh Press, barely looking up when she asked him about his day. She should have known then. Should have known from the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. The kitchen window looked out onto the alley between their building and the next. In the dim light of early morning, she could see Mrs. Chen hanging laundry despite the cold. Shirts and dresses frozen stiff on the line, ice crystals forming on the cotton. Mrs. Chen's husband had died at Guadalcanal in 1942. She'd raised 4 children alone for 3 years now. At least she had dignity, Lorraine thought. At least her husband hadn't chosen to leave. She went to the window and looked down at the empty street, lit by sparse lampposts. Snow fell slowly, in heavy flakes, covering tracks, covering everything. The street cleaner hadn't come out yet, and the road was pristinely white. Somewhere in the distance, a drunk man shouted. A dog barked. An ordinary Pittsburgh morning, no different from thousands of others. Milk trucks would come soon, leaving bottles on doorsteps. Men would emerge from buildings, lunch pails in hand, trudging toward the steel mills and factories that kept this city alive. Women would begin their days, washing, cooking, shopping with ration books, trying to make pennies stretch until Friday's paycheck. But for Lorraine, this morning split her life into before and after. She returned to the bedroom and opened the closet. Half the shelves were empty. He'd taken his things. Not all of them, just the best. His new suit, tailored for the plant's anniversary celebration last October, dark gray wool with narrow lapels that had cost $45 they couldn't really afford. The good shirts she ironed on Sundays, pressing careful creases down the sleeves the way his mother had taught her. The imported sweater he'd brought back from his trip to New York last summer, supposedly a union conference, though now she wondered if that had been a lie too. That made the neighbor women jealous because it was real cashmere, soft as a cloud. He'd left the old things he no longer wore, the frayed work pants with patches on the knees, the shirt with the collar worn through. In the corner of the closet lay his old work coveralls, reeking of machine oil and metal dust. She picked them up, brought them to her face. They smelled like him, smelled like 10 years of married life, smelled like lies. Memories came unbidden, sharp and painful. Their wedding day, June 12, 1933, right in the depths of the Depression. She'd worn her mother's dress, altered to fit, yellowed lace and seed pearls. Warren in a borrowed suit, his hair slicked back with pomade, grinning like he'd won the lottery. They'd honeymooned at her aunt's cabin in the Laurel Highlands, 3 days of playing house, pretending the world wasn't falling apart around them. She remembered how he'd carried her over the threshold, how they'd laughed when he nearly dropped her, how he'd promised to take care of her, to build them a good life, to never let her want for anything. She remembered Marshall's birth in 1935, Warren pacing the hospital corridor for 14 hours, chain-smoking Camels until the nurse scolded him. How his hands had shaken when he first held his son, this tiny, red-faced creature that was part of him, part of her, part of something bigger than both of them. "We made a person," he'd whispered, awed. Douglas came in 1938, easier than Marshall, quicker. Warren had been working double shifts at the plant by then, saving money for a house they'd never buy. He'd been tired always, falling asleep at the dinner table. But he'd still gotten up for midnight feedings, still walked the baby when Douglas had colic. And Russell in 1942, wartime baby, surprise baby. She'd been 32 and thought she was done. Warren had been thrilled. Quote, _2, __, he'd said. Another Hadley boy. He'd held Russell and talked about teaching all 3 of them to play baseball, to fix cars, to be good American men. When had it changed? Lorraine sat on the edge of the bed, trying to pinpoint the moment. When had Warren stopped looking at her? When had conversation become silence? When had he started coming home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers? Maybe it was gradual. Maybe it was after Russell was born and her body never quite recovered, stretch marks silvering her belly, breasts heavy and tired from nursing. Maybe it was when she started working at the munitions plant in 1943, coming home exhausted and smelling of chemicals, too tired for anything but collapse. Maybe it was just time, the slow erosion of whatever had once held them together, worn down like the heels of his work boots. Lorraine sat on the edge of the bed. There were no tears, just cold, clear understanding. She remembered everything now, all the signs she'd ignored. His late returns from work when he talked about rush orders at the plant, emergency production quotas, union meetings that lasted until midnight. The smell of unfamiliar perfume on his shirt collar, sweet, expensive, nothing like the cashmere bouquet talc for 35 cents that she used. The phone calls after which he'd step into the hallway and speak in whispers, covering the receiver with his palm. His new way of dressing, suddenly caring about pressed trousers and matching ties. His irritation at the boys' noise, snapping at them for running in the apartment, for leaving toys on the floor, for being children. His silence at the table when he'd eat while buried in the newspaper, never raising his eyes, never asking about her day or the boys' school. The new watch he'd bought himself last month. Got a good deal, he'd said, but it was a Hamilton. Expensive. The kind of thing he'd never have splurged on before. The haircuts every 2 weeks instead of once a month. The way he hummed while shaving, upbeat tunes from the radio, as if he had something to look forward to. All the signs had been there, but she hadn't wanted to see them. No, she'd seen them but hadn't wanted to acknowledge them. Because acknowledging would have meant destroying the last illusion of a normal American proper life. A husband, 3 children, a 2-bedroom apartment and a brick walk-up, work at the defense plant doing her patriotic duty, a week's vacation at the shore once every 3 years if they could scrape together the money. Stability, predictability, what millions of American women lived for, what the magazines and the movies and the radio shows all said was the dream. And now, it had all collapsed in a single night. What would she tell people? What would she tell her mother, who'd warned her that Warren was too handsome, too charming, that men like that couldn't be trusted? What would she tell the neighbors who'd see his car gone, his name removed from the mailbox? What would she tell the boys? In the next room, Marshall stirred, the oldest. He was 10 years old, a serious boy, mature beyond his years, who already understood more than he said. He had Warren's dark hair but her gray eyes, her careful nature. A good student, responsible, the kind of boy teachers praised. A minute later, the door creaked, and he came out into the hallway in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes with his fists. "Ma, why's the light on?" Lorraine turned. Her son stood in the doorway, rumpled, small, with sticking-up whorls of dark hair. He didn't know yet. Didn't know that his father had just erased them from his life like unwanted lines from a rough draft. "Go back to bed, Marsh," she said quietly. "You've got school tomorrow." "Where's Dad? His car's not in the lot." Lorraine froze. She didn't know what to answer. She hadn't prepared for this conversation. No one is ever prepared for such conversations. Dad had to go on a business trip. The lie sounded false even to her own ears. Marshall looked at her with a long, adult gaze in which understanding already showed. Children always know more than adults think. They sense falsehood the way animals sense danger. "For how long?" "I don't know, son. I don't know." Marshall stood there for a long moment, bare feet on the cold floor, pajama bottoms too short because he was growing so fast. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and she saw him register the cardigan around her shoulders, his father's cardigan, and the empty closet visible through the bedroom door, and the way she was sitting on the bed like someone who'd been struck. "He's not coming back, is he?" The question hung in the air. Lorraine wanted to lie again, wanted to protect him, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He deserved truth. He deserved at least that. "I don't think so, baby. I don't think so." Marshall nodded slowly. His face didn't change. He didn't cry. He just nodded, absorbing this information the way he absorbed everything. Seriously, carefully, filing it away to process later. "Does Doug know? Does Russell?" "Not yet. They're still sleeping." "What are we gonna do?" The question was so adult, so practical. What are we gonna do? Not how could he leave, not why doesn't he love us, but what are we gonna do? This 10-year-old boy asking the question that would define their lives going forward. Lorraine said, though she had no idea if it was true. Marshall nodded again and went back to his room. Lorraine heard him lie down, heard him tossing for a long time, heard the mattress creak. In the next bed slept Douglas, 7 years old, carefree, suspecting nothing. And in the small crib, clutching a worn plush rabbit that had been Marshall's, then Douglas's, now his, Russell breathed softly, 3 years old, the youngest, the most beloved. Lorraine remembered how Warren had held him when the boy was just a few months old, held him and smiled. Quote 19, he'd said. "Look at that, Lorraine. He's got my smile." So back then, he must have still loved them, or pretended to. She could no longer tell where truth ended and performance began. The sky outside began to lighten, gray dawn bleeding into the night. Somewhere in the building, a toilet flushed. A baby cried. Life continued. The city woke up, and Lorraine Hadley sat in her cold bedroom, wearing her abandoned husband's cardigan, trying to figure out how to tell her children that their father had chosen someone else. Later that morning, February 14th, 1945, 7:15 a.m., the boys sat at the kitchen table eating oatmeal. Lorraine had made it with water instead of milk. She'd used the last of the milk ration for yesterday's dinner, and the milkman wouldn't come until tomorrow. The oatmeal was bland, lumpy, but the boys ate without complaint. They'd learned not to complain about food. Douglas chattered about a Valentine's Day party at school, about the cards he'd made from construction paper and paste, about how Miss Henderson was going to bring cookies. Russell played with his spoon, singing a nonsense song, blissfully unaware. Marshall ate in silence, not looking at his mother. Lorraine began, then stopped. "How did you say this? How did you tell children their father didn't want them anymore?" "Dad's not on a business trip," Marshall said suddenly. "Is he, Ma?" Douglas stopped mid-sentence, looked from his brother to his mother. "What?" "Your father," Lorraine's voice caught. She cleared her throat. Quote 26, quote 27. Douglas's face crumpled. "Did we do something bad?" "I'll be better, Ma. I promise I'll be quiet. I won't run in the house. I'll do all my chores. Just tell Dad to come back." The raw hope in his voice nearly broke her. "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. None of you did. This isn't about you." "Then why?" Douglas's voice rose. Quote 31, quote 32. Marshall said flatly. Quote 33, quote 34, Lorraine said sharply. Russell started to cry, not understanding the words but sensing the tension, the fear, the anger. Lorraine picked him up, held him against her shoulder. Quote 36, quote, she said carefully. Quote 37, quote. Quote 38, quote. Douglas asked, practically suddenly. Quote 39, quote. Quote 40, quote. Quote 41, quote. Marshall pushed back from the table. Quote 42, quote. Quote 43, quote. Quote 44, quote. His jaw was set, that stubborn Hadley jaw that Warren had, that Marshall had inherited. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 45, underscore, underscore. Lorraine looked at her oldest son, this boy who was becoming a man too fast, who was already taking on burdens he shouldn't have to carry. "We'll talk about it later. Right now, you all need to get ready for school." The morning routine proceeded mechanically. Washing faces, combing hair, packing lunches, cheese sandwiches, an apple each, crackers. Lorraine walked them to the corner where Douglas would catch the bus to his elementary school, and Marshall would walk the 6 blocks to his. Russell stayed home with her. She'd take him to Mrs. Kowalski's before her shift at the plant. She watched her sons walk away, Douglas's hand in Marshall's, and felt the full weight of her new reality settle on her shoulders. She was alone now, truly alone, and she had 3 children depending on her. 3 weeks later, early March 1945, Lorraine stood in line at the plant's personnel office. Ahead of her were another 15 people, all with folders, with forms, with that tired expression people get when accustomed to bureaucratic runaround. She clutched her marriage certificate and identification papers. The document corners were creased, the paper worn. During these 3 weeks, Warren hadn't called once, hadn't appeared, hadn't sent money. She'd tried calling his plant, but the secretary answered dryly and officially. February 9th, 5 days before he left. So it had all been planned. He'd prepared. Quit his job, built himself a new life while she cooked his meals and washed his socks and raised his children. She'd learned the truth by accident. Her neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, meeting her at the building entrance 3 days after Warren left, whispered with false sympathy. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 48, underscore, underscore. Vivian Cartwright. 30 years old, secretary at the county administration office, no children, no husband, no stretch marks or tired eyes or hands worn raw from lye soap and scrubbing. A fashionable pageboy haircut and imported Cuban heel pumps that probably cost more than Lorraine's entire wardrobe. Lorraine knew her by sight. Had seen her a couple times at 4th of July parades when Vivian walked in the municipal workers' contingent with a small American flag, smiling that bright commercial smile, hair perfect, seams straight on her stockings. Beautiful, well-groomed, without the weight of motherhood, without the exhaustion of keeping 3 children alive on $48 a month. The kind of woman a man like Warren would want after 10 years of dirty diapers and screaming kids and a wife who fell asleep before 9 o'clock every night. Next! Lorraine flinched, stepped up to the window. The personnel clerk, a woman of about 50 with a tired face and reading glasses on a chain, looked at her without interest. Behind her hung a portrait of President Roosevelt and a board with commendations for outstanding workers. A sign read, "Do your part for victory." Yes? I need to, Lorraine faltered. I need to file for child support. The clerk sighed. She'd seen dozens like Lorraine. American prosperity always had an underside that the newsreels never showed. For every smiling family in the Norman Rockwell paintings, there were 10 like this. Abandoned, struggling, invisible. The clerk removed her glasses and wearily rubbed the bridge of her nose. On her desk sat 3 empty teacups and a half-eaten jelly donut, a newspaper with headlines about the bombing of Dresden. The clerk's voice softened for a second, revealing the woman beneath the bureaucrat. But without documents, I'm powerless. These are the rules. Go to the police. Here's the precinct address. She scribbled something on a slip of paper and handed it to Lorraine. Ask for Officer Kowalski. He's good with these cases. Next in line. The window closed. Lorraine exited the building. Rain was falling, cold March rain that cut to the bone. She stood by the steps without opening her umbrella, feeling the water run down her face, mixing with unshed tears. People passed by, some glancing at her with pity or judgment or indifference, others hurrying past, hiding their eyes. 3 children. $48 a month salary at the chemical plant. Rent, $20. Coal for heating, another $5. Food, clothing, school supplies, daycare for Russell while she worked. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how you figured it. Last week she'd applied for county assistance, sat in a windowless room answering humiliating questions. How long had she been married? Was she sure the children were Warren's? Had she done anything to drive him away? Was she a good housekeeper? A good wife? The social worker, a pinch-faced woman in her 40s, had made notes in a manila folder, lips pursed in disapproval. __quote_61_limited resources. While men were dying in Europe and the Pacific, while billions were spent on tanks and planes and bombs, there were limited resources for American children whose fathers decided they didn't want to be fathers anymore. May 15th, 1945, Police Precinct. Officer Kowalski, no relation to her neighbor Mrs. Kowalski, though they shared that common Polish surname, was a beat cop for 20 years, a man who'd seen everything. He listened to Lorraine and made notes in a worn notebook. His office was small, smoke-filled, with peeling paint on the walls and a portrait of J. Edgar Hoover looking on disapprovingly. He'd heard stories like this hundreds of times. Left his wife with children. Disappeared. Won't pay. Classic American domestic tragedy. The kind that didn't make the headlines but ate away at families like rust eats metal. You say he worked at the McKeesport steel plant? Yes, as a foreman in the rolling mill. But he quit on February 9th. New job? I don't know. He's living with a woman named Vivian Cartwright on the north side. That's all I know. Kowalski sighed and set down his pen. Outside the window, children were playing, shouting, laughing. Life went on, regardless. Mrs. Hadley, I'm going to be honest with you. Cases like this, they're difficult. Pennsylvania law says a father has to support his children, but enforcing it is another matter. We can locate him, serve him papers, but if he moves to another state, we lose jurisdiction. So he can just abandon us and face no consequences? I didn't say that. I said it's difficult. Kowalski leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Here's what we'll do. I'll send an officer to the Cartwright address. We'll verify he's there. Once we have confirmation, you can file for a support order through the courts. A judge will determine how much he owes. And then? And then we garnish his wages if he's employed. If he's not, we put a lien on his property. If he refuses to pay, he can be held in contempt of court. Can he go to jail? Theoretically. In practice, judges are reluctant to jail fathers because then they definitely can't pay. It's complicated, Mrs. Hadley. The system isn't designed for situations like yours. Lorraine sat in the hard wooden chair across from Kowalski's desk and felt defeat wash over her. The system wasn't designed for her. The laws, the courts, the bureaucracy, none of it was made to help women like her. It was made to keep families together, and when families fell apart, it had no answers. What should I do? Kowalski's face softened. He had daughters, grandchildren. Quote, 75, quote, 76, quote, 77, quote, 78, quote, 79. Lorraine nodded numbly. More paperwork, more bureaucracy, more fighting for what should have been freely given. She left the precinct and walked toward the bus stop. The war in Europe was ending. Everyone said so. Germany was collapsing. Victory was coming. But Lorraine felt no joy. Her own private war was just beginning. June 1945. The confrontation. Officer Kowalski did his job. Located Warren at Vivian Cartwright's apartment on Brighton Road. Served him papers. Warren was ordered to appear in family court on June 22nd. Lorraine saw him for the first time in 4 months across a courtroom. He looked good. Better than when he'd left. His suit was new, well-fitted. His shoes were shined. He'd lost weight, looked younger. Happy. While she'd been eating crackers and cheese for dinner so her boys could have meat, he'd been living well. The proceedings were brief, clinical. Judge Harrison, a gray-haired man in his 60s, reviewed the case file. Warren's lawyer, he'd hired a lawyer, argued that his client's financial situation was precarious, that he'd taken a pay cut at his new job, that he could afford only minimal support. "How much are you proposing, counselor?" Judge Harrison asked. $20 a month, Your Honor. $5 per child. Lorraine's lawyer, a young man fresh from law school who was handling her case pro bono through a church charity, stood up. Warren's lawyer objected. "My client has his own living expenses." "Living expenses he chose when he abandoned his family," Lorraine's lawyer shot back. Judge Harrison raised his hand. Quote 85 Warren stood. For the first time, he looked directly at Lorraine. She stared back, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her tears. Judge Harrison said, Warren's voice was flat, emotionless. "Good. Court adjourned." Outside the courthouse, Warren caught up to Lorraine. She was walking toward the bus stop, trying not to run, trying to maintain dignity. "Lorraine, wait!" She stopped, turned. "What do you want, Warren?" "I just want to say, I'm sorry it had to be like this." The audacity of it stunned her. Sorry it had to be like this? You abandoned your children in the middle of the night. You left a note. You walked away from 10 years of marriage like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. But Lorraine, we weren't happy. You know that. I was happy enough. I had my children. I had a home. I had a husband who was supposed to honor his vows. Warren looked away, uncomfortable. I'm with someone who makes me feel alive again, who doesn't nag me about money or complain about being tired all the time, who actually enjoys my company. The cruelty of it cut deep. I was tired because I was raising your children and working and running a household. I complained about money because we never had enough. And I'm sorry if being a wife and mother wasn't entertaining enough for you, Warren. I'm sorry I couldn't be your dancing partner while I was pregnant and exhausted and trying to keep us all fed. I deserve to be happy, Lorraine. And your sons? Do they deserve a father? Warren had no answer for that. He just stood there, expensive suit, shine shoes, looking like success while his family scraped by. You'll get your $40, he said finally. I'll pay what the judge ordered, but don't expect anything more. I don't expect anything from you anymore, Lorraine said quietly. You made your choice. Live with it. She walked away and didn't look back. 1946 to 1950, the struggle years. The $40 came every month, though often late. Lorraine would wait by the mailbox, anxiety building as the first of the month came and went. Sometimes the check arrived on the 5th. Once it came on the 15th. But it came. $40. It paid for half the rent and maybe a week's groceries. The rest Lorraine stretched like taffy, thin and brittle. She bought day-old bread from the bakery for half price. She mended clothes until they fell apart. She walked to work to save bus fare. She skipped lunch. The boys grew. Marshall shot up 6 inches between his 11th and 13th birthdays, constantly hungry, eating everything in sight. Douglas became obsessed with baseball, wore out shoes playing in the street. Russell started kindergarten, needed supplies, needed clothes that fit. Lorraine took in sewing. Hemmed dresses for Mrs. Chen, altered suits for Mr. Novak, the superintendent. 50 cents here, $1 there. Every penny counted. In 1947, Marshall got his paper route despite Lorraine's objections. He woke at 4:30 every morning, delivered 70 papers in rain and snow and summer heat, earned $2.50 a week. He gave it all to his mother. Lorraine protested. He was 12 years old. 12 years old and sacrificing his childhood because his father chose a woman with no stretch marks and Cuban heel pumps. In 1948, Douglas started working at the corner grocery, bagging items and sweeping floors after school. $3 a week. He gave that to Lorraine too. Quote, "They were good boys. Too good. They'd learned too young that the world was hard, that fathers left, that survival meant sacrifice." Russell, the youngest, didn't fully understand why his father was gone. Sometimes he'd ask when Daddy was coming home. Lorraine never knew what to say. Marshall usually answered for her. "He's not coming, Russ. It's just us now." In 1949, Lorraine's mother died. Cancer. Lorraine took the bus to Erie for the funeral, left the boys with Mrs. Kowalski. At the cemetery, standing in the rain, she broke down. All the tears she'd held in for 4 years came out. Her mother was gone. Her marriage was gone. Her youth was gone. She was 39 years old and felt 90. But she went home. Because the boys needed her. Because she was all they had. In 1950, Warren married Vivian. Lorraine learned about it from the newspaper, a small announcement in the society pages. Mr. Warren Hadley and Miss Vivian Cartwright were married Saturday at Trinity Episcopal Church. The couple will reside on Brighton Road. Marshall found the newspaper, saw his mother looking at the announcement. "You okay, Ma?" "I'm fine, baby." "He's not worth it. You know that, right? He's not worth one tear." Lorraine looked at her 15-year-old son, this boy who'd become a man because his father wouldn't be. "I know, Marsh. I know." But that night, alone in her room after the boys were asleep, she allowed herself one moment of grief. Not for Warren, she'd stopped grieving him years ago, but for the girl she'd been in 1933, standing at the altar in her mother's yellow dress, believing in forever. For the dreams she'd had of a house with a yard, of family Sundays, of growing old beside someone. Those dreams were truly dead now, buried beneath a courthouse wedding announcement and a Brighton Road address. Winter 1950. The coldest season. December brought brutal cold. The building's boiler broke 3 times. Lorraine and the boys wore coats indoors, slept under every blanket they owned. She developed a cough that rattled in her chest, wouldn't go away. Mrs. Chen urged her to see a doctor. "Can't afford it," Lorraine said. "You can't afford to die either. Those boys need you." She went to the free clinic on Carson Street, waited 4 hours to see a harried doctor who listened to her lungs and prescribed rest. "You're exhausted," he said bluntly. "Your body's breaking down. You need to slow down." "I have 3 children and a full-time job. I can't slow down." "Then you'll be dead in 10 years. Your choice." She wasn't dead in 10 years, but the doctor was right about the breaking down part. By 1952, she had chronic bronchitis. By 1954, her hands ached with arthritis from the cold and the constant washing, scrubbing, wringing. By 1956, she needed reading glasses she couldn't afford, squinted at newspapers and recipes until Marshall bought her a pair from the drugstore. Her body kept score of every sacrifice, every skipped meal. Every night she'd worked double shifts and then come home to cook and clean and be both parents. The toll accumulated in her bones, her lungs, her heart. Summer 1951. Douglas's birthday. Douglas turned 13 on June 3rd. Lorraine saved for 3 months to buy him a baseball glove. A real leather one, not the cheap canvas kind that fell apart after a season. $8.95 at Gimbel's Sporting Goods. She presented it to him at breakfast, along with a chocolate cake she'd made from scratch, hoarding sugar ration stamps for weeks. Douglas's face lit up like Christmas. "Ma, a real glove! A real one!" "Can't have my boy playing with garbage," she said, trying to sound casual even though those $8.95 represented nearly a week's food budget. He hugged her so hard she lost her breath. Marshall and Russell watched, grinning. This was wealth to them, a real birthday present, a whole cake, their mother's smile. That afternoon, Douglas's friends came to play stickball in the street. Lorraine watched from the window, saw her son showing off his new glove, saw the other boys admiring it, saw Douglas's pride, his joy. $8.95, best money she'd ever spent. Later that evening, Douglas came to her while she was washing dishes. He hesitated, then, __quote_, 126 __. Lorraine's throat tightened. "You're a good boy, Douglas. I got a good ma." Fall 1952. Russell starts school. Russell's first day of 5th grade. Lorraine walked him the 4 blocks Lorraine walked him the 4 blocks to elementary school, holding his small hand. He wore Marshall's old clothes, taken in and patched, shoes that had been Douglas's. But his face was scrubbed clean, his hair carefully combed, his lunch packed with care. Peanut butter sandwich, apple, cookies she'd made. "You be good," she told him at the schoolhouse steps. "Listen to your teacher. Be polite. Be kind to the other children." "Will you be here when school's over?" His voice was small, uncertain. "I have to work, baby, but Marshall will come get you. He'll walk you home." "I wish you could be here." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." She watched him walk into the building, so small, so vulnerable. Other mothers lingered, chatting, comparing notes on their children. Lorraine didn't join them. Didn't have time. She had to catch the bus to the plant, had to clock in by 8. On the bus, she stared out the window and fought the familiar guilt. She should be able to pick up her son from school. Should be able to be there when he came home, ask about his day, give him milk and cookies. That was what mothers did in the magazines, in the movies. That was the American dream. But she was living the American reality. Working class, abandoned, making do. The dream was for people like Vivian Cartwright, who had Warren's income and no children to feed. 1953. The Christmas that almost wasn't. November 1953. Lorraine opened the mail and found a letter from the landlord. Rent increase. $25 a month now, up from $20. A 25% increase. Her salary hadn't gone up. Warren's $40 stayed the same. She sat at the kitchen table and did the math over and over, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. She was $5 short every month now. $5 she didn't have. She went to the plant supervisor, asked for more overtime. "Can't help you, Lorraine. We're cutting back after the holidays. Might have to lay people off." She went to the church, asked the priest if there was any assistance available. "We have a Christmas charity fund," Father Murphy said. "Toys for children, food baskets. Would that help?" Charity. The word tasted like ash. But she had 3 boys who deserved Christmas. "Yes, Father. That would help." Christmas morning, 1953. The tree was scrawny. Lorraine had bought it on Christmas Eve when they were practically giving them away. $2 for a 6-footer with a bare spot and back. But the boys had decorated it with paper chains and popcorn strings. And in the dim morning light, it looked almost magical. Under the tree, gifts from the church charity. For Marshall, 16 now, an algebra textbook, used but in good condition. For Douglas, 11, a baseball, not new but clean, usable. For Russell, 7, a wooden train set, hand-carved, beautiful. The boys opened their gifts in silence. No squeals of joy, no excited chatter. Just quiet gratitude and the understanding that this was what they had, and it was enough. "Ma," Russell said carefully, holding his train, "this is the best present I ever got." She knew he was lying. Knew he saw other boys at school with store-bought toys, electric trains, shiny new things. But he was trying to protect her feelings. This 7-year-old boy who'd learned too young to hide disappointment. __quote _141 __, she said, throat tight. Marshall met her eyes across the room. 18 years old and already understanding everything his mother couldn't say. He mouthed, "We're okay, Ma." She nodded. They were okay. Not thriving, not comfortable, but alive. Together. Okay. Spring 1954. Lorraine collapses. April 15th, 1954. Lorraine was at work, operating the chemical mixer when the room started spinning. She grabbed the counter, tried to steady herself, but her legs gave out. She woke up in the plant infirmary, the nurse taking her pulse. "What happened?" Lorraine asked. "You fainted. When's the last time you ate?" Lorraine tried to remember. Breakfast? No, she'd given her portion to Russell. Dinner last night? She'd eaten half a sandwich. Yesterday, I think. The nurse's face hardened. Quote 146, quote 147, quote 148. That evening, Marshall found her sitting at the kitchen table, head in her hands. She told him. He didn't say anything, just went to his room, came back with an envelope. Inside, $60, 3 months of his paper route savings. "Marsh, no!" "Take it, Ma. You always take care of us. Let us take care of you." Douglas heard, came out of his room with his own savings, $35 from the grocery store job. "Boys, I can't." "You can," Marshall said firmly. "You will. You're taking that week off. You're going to rest and eat and get better. Because we need you. We need you healthy and alive, not working yourself to death." Russell, 12 years old, brought his piggy bank. $7.23 in pennies and nickels. "For Ma," he said solemnly. Lorraine broke down then, sobbing, holding her 3 boys. These children who'd become her caregivers because their father wouldn't be. $102.23. More money than she'd had in her wallet in years. Given freely, with love, by children who understood sacrifice because they'd watched her make it every day of their lives. 1951 to 1955. The boys grow up. Marshall graduated high school in 1953, class valedictorian. Lorraine sat in the audience, bursting with pride, watching her son cross the stage to accept scholarships. University of Pittsburgh, full ride, academic achievement. He'd done it. Despite everything, he'd done it. Warren wasn't there. Hadn't called, hadn't sent a card. $40 a month, like clockwork now, but nothing else. No birthday wishes, no Christmas presents, no acknowledgement that he had 3 sons who were growing into fine young men. Marshall went to Pitt, studied accounting, worked part-time at a law firm as a clerk, sent money home to Lorraine every month, $10, $20 when he could manage it. Douglas graduated in 1956, joined the Navy. Lorraine cried when he left for basic training, her boy in uniform, serving his country. He sent his paychecks home, kept only enough for necessities. Russell, the youngest, turned 14 in 1956. Good student like his brothers, quieter, more introspective. He played piano at church, had a gift for music. Lorraine scrimped to pay for lessons, 50 cents a week to old Mrs. Grabowski down the hall. The boys were turning out well, despite Warren, despite poverty, despite everything. They were good men. 1957, Marshall's discovery. Marshall was 22 now, graduating from Pitt with honors, accepting a job at a downtown accounting firm. While processing estate tax paperwork at his firm, he saw Warren's name on a tax return. Curiosity got the better of him. Warren was making good money. Very good money. Plant supervisor at Northside Steel, pulling in $6,000 a year. Living in a nice house in Crafton Heights that he and Vivian had bought in 1954. Driving a new Chevrolet Bel Air. $6,000 a year. And sending Lorraine $40 a month, $480 a year. 8% of his income for 3 children he'd fathered. Marshall sat at his desk, rage building. He'd watched his mother sacrifice everything. Watched her wear the same coat for 10 years. Watched her eat crackers for dinner so they could have meatloaf. Watched her work double shifts when the plant needed overtime. And all the while, Warren was living in comfort. He called Douglas, who was on shore leave in San Diego. Marshall told him. Silence on the line. Douglas finally said, 1958. The legal battle begins. Marshall filed the motion himself, typed it on the firm's typewriter after hours. Motion to modify child support order. He detailed Warren's income, detailed Lorraine's expenses, detailed the fact that Russell was still a minor for 5 more years and needed support for college. Warren fought it, hired the same lawyer from before, argued that the original order was binding, that his increased income was irrelevant, that Lorraine should get a better job if she needed more money. Judge Harrison was retired now. The new judge, Thomas Brennan, was younger, less sympathetic. Mr. Hadley is already paying support. Mrs. Hadley works. The boys are capable of contributing. I see no basis for modification. Motion denied. Marshall appealed. Spent hours at the law library researching precedents. Found cases where support had been increased based on changed circumstances. Filed again. The second judge, Eleanor Mitchell, was different. A woman in her 50s, one of only 3 female judges in Allegheny County. She read the file carefully, reviewed the financial documents Marshall had meticulously prepared, looked at Warren across the courtroom with unconcealed disdain. Mr. Hadley, you're earning $6,000 per year? Yes, Your Honor, but my expenses... Your expenses include a 3-bedroom house, a new car, and club memberships, according to these tax returns. Meanwhile, your 3 sons live in a 2-bedroom walk-up, and your ex-wife hasn't bought a new winter coat in a decade. I'm increasing your support obligation to $100 per month, effective immediately. Additionally, you will pay for Russell's college tuition and fees when he reaches 18. Any objections will be noted and overruled. Warren turned red. This is outrageous. I have a new life, a new family to think about. You have the family you abandoned to think about, Mr. Hadley. These boys are your legal and moral responsibility. You chose to father them. Now you'll support them properly. Next case. Outside the courthouse, Marshall called Lorraine from a payphone. "Ma, we won. You're getting $100 a month now, and Dad has to pay for Russell's college." Lorraine started crying. "Marsh, you did this?" "Doug and I together. We couldn't let him keep cheating you." "I'm so proud of you boys. So proud." 1960 to 1965. Final years of obligation. The $100 a month made a real difference. Lorraine could finally save a little, could buy a new coat, could go to the doctor when she was sick instead of toughing it out. Russell had what he needed for school: books, supplies, a decent winter jacket that actually fit. Life was still hard, but not desperate, not terrifying. She could breathe. For the first time in 15 years, Lorraine could walk past a store window without calculating pennies, could buy a pound of good coffee instead of the cheap chicory blend, could replace worn-out sheets. Small luxuries, barely worth mentioning to most people, but to her, they were miracles. The boys noticed the change. "Ma, you look better," Russell said one evening in 1961. He was right. She'd gained weight, had color in her cheeks, smiled more easily. Warren paid, but resentfully. He'd call Lorraine sometimes, late at night, drunk, angry. "You turned my own sons against me, turned them into lawyers and collection agents, turned them into your weapons." "I didn't turn them into anything, Warren. You did that yourself when you walked out." "Vivian says you're poisoning them against me, says you've spent 20 years making me into a villain." "I didn't have to make you into anything. You chose your role. You played it perfectly." He'd hang up. The checks kept coming. $100 on the first of every month, like clockwork now, because the court had ordered direct wage garnishment. Warren couldn't withhold payment anymore. The money was taken before he ever saw it. In 1962, Russell graduated high school. Top of his class. Full scholarship to Juilliard for music. Lorraine cried at his graduation, overwhelmed with joy and pride. 3 sons, all successful, all good men. She'd done it. Without Warren, despite Warren, she'd raised 3 fine boys. Russell turned 21 in 1963. The child support obligation ended, but the court order still required Warren to pay Russell's tuition. He fought it again, argued that Russell's scholarships covered most costs. Judge Mitchell, still on the bench, was unmoved. "The order says tuition and fees, Mr. Hadley. That includes books, room, board, and supplies. You'll pay $2,000 per year for 4 years. The order stands." Warren paid, cursed and complained and paid. 1965, final payment and aftermath. The last payment went through in May 1965, when Russell completed his junior year. 20 years after Warren had walked out, the debt was paid. Lorraine was 55 now. She'd retired from the munitions plant the year before, her lungs damaged from decades of chemical exposure. She lived on a small pension and Social Security in the same apartment on Melwood Avenue. It was enough. Warren was 58, still working at the steel plant, still married to Vivian, though the marriage was reportedly cold. No children. Vivian had never wanted them. Warren had his freedom, his comfort, his nice house. But he was alone. His sons wanted nothing to do with him. He tried once to reach out, wrote a letter to Marshall in 1967. A simple note, __quote _183 __. Marshall read it, showed it to his brothers. They were all together for Sunday dinner at Lorraine's apartment. They sat in silence at the kitchen table where they'd once eaten watery oatmeal and wondered when the next check would come. Douglas spoke first. Marshall looked at the letter, this pathetic attempt at reconciliation. 22 years after walking out, Warren wanted to meet for coffee. Marshall said quietly. Russell said, though his voice was uncertain. Marshall said firmly. He gestured at the letter. Douglas nodded. Russell looked torn. Marshall said, "They never replied to the letter." 6 months later, Warren tried calling. Marshall answered, listened to Warren's stammering attempt at explanation, then quietly said, "Don't call here again. You're not part of this family," and hung up. Warren never tried again. Fall 1968. Lorraine's decline. Lorraine had been sick for years. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from the chemical plant, cardiovascular problems from decades of stress, diabetes from poor nutrition and constant worry. She was only 58, but her body was finished. The boys took turns caring for her. Marshall had her move into his house in Squirrel Hill. He could afford it now, was a partner at his firm, had a wife and children of his own. In October, she went into the hospital. The doctors said weeks, maybe days. They gathered around her bed, Marshall and Douglas and Russell, these 3 men who'd once been scared little boys listening to their mother cry in the night. She was conscious, lucid, but weak. "My boys," she whispered, "you turned out so good, so good." "Ma, we had a good teacher," Marshall said, holding her hand. "You did what I couldn't. You made him pay." "We did it for you, Ma. You deserved better." She smiled weakly. "I got better. I got you 3. She died on October 23, 1968. Peaceful, in her sleep, surrounded by her sons. She was 58 years old. Too young. Too worn out by hardship. The funeral was well attended. Neighbors, co-workers, friends from church, people from the old building on Melwood Avenue. People who remembered her kindness, her strength, her dignity. Mrs. Chen came, elderly now, leaning on a cane, and wept openly. "Your mother was a saint," she told Marshall. "She helped me when my husband died, watched my children when I had to work, never asked for anything in return." Marshall gave the eulogy. His voice broke several times, but he pushed through. He spoke of a woman who worked 2 jobs to keep her family fed, who never complained, never gave up, never stopped fighting, who taught her sons that family meant loyalty, not blood, that being a parent meant staying, not leaving, that real love was measured in sacrifice. She raised 3 men, Marshall said. 3 men who knew what it meant to honor a commitment, to keep promises, to be there when it's hard. She did that alone, without help, without mercy from the man who should have been beside her. But she did it, and we're here because of her strength, her example, her love. Warren read the obituary in the newspaper. He thought about going to the funeral, stood in his bedroom holding his dark suit, staring at himself in the mirror. Thought about walking into that church, facing those 3 sons who hated him, facing the woman's coffin and all the people who would judge him. He stayed home, alone. That night, he got drunk for the first time in years. Vivian found him passed out in the living room, an empty bottle of whiskey beside him. She didn't ask what was wrong. They'd stopped really talking years ago. January 1972. Warren's End. Warren Hadley died of a heart attack in his living room on January 8, 1972. He was 65. A neighbor found him 3 days later when mail piled up and the newspaper deliveries remained unclaimed. The coroner's report listed myocardial infarction, cirrhosis of the liver, gastric ulcers, emphysema. His body was worn out. Vivian had left him 2 years earlier, moved to Arizona, sent divorce papers. She'd been his second wife to abandon him. Ironic. The county handled the burial. No one came to the funeral. He was buried in a pauper's section, no headstone, just a numbered plot. Marshall learned of his father's death from a county clerk who called trying to locate next of kin for final paperwork. Marshall informed his brothers. They sat in Douglas's living room, drinking coffee, processing the news. Douglas said, finally. Marshall said. Russell was quiet for a long time. Then, quote, 210. Marshall considered. Quote, 211. They didn't discuss it again. There was nothing to discuss. Warren Hadley was dead, and the world was no different than it had been when he was alive. He'd left no legacy worth remembering. May 1975, Mother's Day at the grave. Marshall, Douglas, and Russell stood at their mother's grave in Homewood Cemetery. Flowers, roses, her favorite. Quiet. Remembrance. Lorraine lay beneath a modest granite stone. Quote, 212. Quote, 213. Marshall said quietly, quote, 214. Quote, the wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Birds sang. Life continued. But they remembered, would always remember. 1985, 50 years later. Marshall was 50 now. Douglas was 47. Russell was 43. They had families, children, grandchildren. They met once a month for dinner, tradition. Talked about life, about their kids, about the Steelers, about memories. One day, Marshall's grandson, bright-eyed 8-year-old named after Lorraine's father, asked. Marshall looked at the boy, so innocent, so trusting. The boy nodded, processing this information. Marshall considered. The three brothers raised their cups of coffee. They drank. Justice had prevailed. Love had won. Memory remained. Epilogue. February 14th, 1995, 50 years later. On February 14th, 1995, the three Hadley brothers met at a diner in Pittsburgh. 50 years to the day their father had walked out. Marshall was 60 now, retired from the accounting firm, spending his days with grandchildren. Douglas, 57, retired from the Navy after 30 years, living in Florida but visiting often. Russell, 53, music professor at Carnegie Mellon, conductor of the city's youth orchestra. Gray-haired, weathered, but still strong, still together. 50 years, Douglas said, looking out the diner window at the falling snow. Half a century since that night. And we survived, Russell said. More than survived. We built good lives, families, careers. We broke the cycle. Marshall looked at his brothers. You know what Ma told me once? Right before she died. She was in the hospital, barely conscious, but she grabbed my hand and said, I don't regret anything. Because he left, you boys learned what a real man is. You learned to stay. You learned that love is a choice you make every day. That's worth more than anything he could have given you. Russell's eyes were wet. Douglas said. Marshall said. They sat in silence, three old men who'd been boys together, who'd weathered abandonment and poverty and hardship, who'd learned that family is a choice, not an obligation. To Ma, Marshall said, raising his coffee cup. To Ma, his brothers echoed. Outside, snow fell on Pittsburgh, just as it had 50 years before. But the Hadley brothers were warm, together, remembering the woman who'd taught them that love is measured not in words, but in staying, in showing up, in being there when it's hard. Warren Hadley had missed it all, had chosen to miss it all, had walked out on a cold February morning and lost everything that mattered. The brothers had their answer, had always had it. The man who stays is the man who matters. The one who leaves is just a ghost. They finished their coffee and went home to their families, carrying forward the lesson their mother had taught them through her example. That real strength is staying. Real love is enduring. Real family is the people who don't leave. And that, after 50 years, was the final word on Warren Hadley. He left. They stayed. That was all that needed to be said.